All right. So good morning, everyone. And uh, we are in the home stretch of a lecture series, right? On parties and when they turn for and against democracy. And I've tried to present you a fair bit of evidence recently after having looked at the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries in Europe and the United States, as well as philosophical and sociological perspectives, right? Trying to cover the waterfront on modern political parties. I've focused primarily the last few lectures on 21st century America and using Ezra Klein's, I think, very illuminating why we're polarized as a way into our contemporary 21st century American form of polarization, and try to use his work to really shine a spotlight on race and the racial division between parties, the way in which the Democratic Party has successfully navigated the transition into being a multiracial coalition party, and the way in which that's affected, I should say, reflected in both the views of its electorate, that their position on issues to do with race and reckoning with a more diverse society and attempting to do justice to all members of a racially diverse democracy. And on the other hand, the actual composition of the coalition that supports the Democrats is genuinely and deeply multiracial. And when we look at it from the other perspective, the perspective of the Democratic's rival party, the Republicans, we see both that Republicans have remained kind of staunchly opposed to many aspects of the diversification of America and policies that would aim to make the United States a more equitable and inclusive multiracial society, and that their voting bloc remains dominantly white, 90% white. And that divide is really about who belongs in the United States, who doesn't belong, fully included as a citizen who has standing in our country, equal standing, and what that entails. And it's a kind of debate about the existential nature of the future of the United States. Do we want to go back to being a dominantly white society? Do we want to preserve the preeminence of white people in our politics, in our economy, in our culture? Or are we ready and willing and, in fact, enthusiastic about embracing a more diverse future for the United States? And so that drives a deep kind of polarization. This is not an issue that admits ready compromise. In fact, it's an issue in which both sides tend to view the other side as betraying fundamental principles, as in some way either being racist or not reckoning with the status of the country as an immigration country, a country in which almost everybody who is here immigrated at one point or another, or their ancestors immigrated to the country. And on the other hand, the other side views the Democrats, the Republicans view the Democrats as un-American, as failing to preserve the core of the culture of the United States as a dominantly white Anglo-Saxon Protestant country, right? And traditions and values that have, on this view, made America what it is, are being betrayed or let go of too readily, too easily, that we are skating into perhaps cultural or civilizational collapse without even recognizing how disastrous the course we're on is. And so again, really deep polarization. And then we looked also at the idea that in the 21st century, partisan polarization is driven by the parties and by their leaders and by the media and increasingly embraced and incorporated into the political identity of average citizens, that's a self-reinforcing cycle that produces more and more extreme partisanship, that it also appears to be rooted deeply in political psychology. On the one hand, in the division between those who are more open to rapid social, cultural, economic, and political change, and on the other hand, those who find that to be threatening. And that is, in a sense, reconfiguring our politics, where the division between openness to or hesitation about rapid change is becoming one of the major sources of partisan alignment. And on the other hand, when we look at the fact that those attitudes and psychological types often overlap with race, often overlap with political geography. Do you live in an urban area? If so, you're much more likely to be open and liberal and progressive. Do you live in a rural or an ex-urban area? If so, you're much more likely to be closed and conservative and more traditional. It's overlapping, obviously, with race. It's overlapping with economic standing, socioeconomic status. It's overlapping with educational level. And so increasingly we have not multiple and cross-cutting divisions, right? You know, I might be Jewish and you might be Protestant and somebody else might be Catholic, but we're all Democrats. But nevertheless, sometimes our religious identity pulls us in one way, our political partisanship pulls us in another, and that makes it a little bit easier to break up or disaggregate our partisan identity. But when all those things align, when all those identities overlap, we tend to fall into one major axis of separation. Being Democrat or being Republican tells you everything you need to know about the person. And increasingly, then we fall into an in-group, out-group mentality in which I know which side we're on, and we all are right, and the other side is not only wrong, but hostile, and we need to protect ourselves against them. That this is the tone and tenor of 21st century partisanship, and it taps into deep cognitive and psychological structures that are rooted perhaps in the very organization of our brains, and that this is distorting our cognition as opposed to trying to think through what's the best argument about this issue or that issue? Or can I form some kind of coalition or compromise or consensus with that group or this group on this issue? We are increasingly treating our issues as badges of our partisan identity. We absolutely cannot compromise on them. And hence, knowing what your identity is dictates what your position on the policy is, and dictates that you will not compromise with the other side. So you're not in this environment inclined to think things through for themselves or to learn from the other side. And I want to start with two examples of this. And so this is just to illustrate the way in which partisanship is distorting cognition in the United States in the 21st century. Here's the first example, and I think we've looked at this together before upon occasion. This is partisan perceptions of how the economy is doing and when they shift or when the inflection points are. And as you can see, right, when George W. Bush was president, in general, Republicans thought the economy was doing pretty well, and Democrats thought it was doing pretty poorly. And then around 2007, 2008, it really did start to go down the tubes, right? We had the Great Recession, and yet this partisan differential persisted. And then in 2008, Barack Obama got elected president. And as you can see, on a dime, democratic perceptions of how the economy is doing started to change, right? Became much more positive. And the Republican perceptions, which were already being driven down by the Great Recession, then continued to stay low throughout the entire presidency of Barack Obama. And then the day that Donald Trump gets elected, all of a sudden, on a dime, Republican perceptions of how the economy is doing go way up. Democratic perceptions go way down, right? And by the way, that's a 63-point swing in perceptions that occurs in the period from November 2016 to January 2017, right? And so really striking illustration of the way our partisanship shapes our perception of reality. Now, I want to say that this might not be quite so completely irrational as it looks. Yes, all of these people are looking at the same economy and coming to disparate conclusions and changing their mind very quickly about what that economy is doing, depending upon who is the president. And as we know, the president actually has very limited ability to affect on their own how the economy is doing. But having said all of that, right, and so that speaks to the irrationalism, the distortion of cognition, I will say one thing about this, which is when Barack Obama is elected president, it is rational for some people to hope, in light of his election, policy may change. And the new policy may be more beneficial for people like me. And as a result, my economic prospects may increase. And so maybe that's clouding the picture a little bit. These people aren't just saying, how do you think the economy is doing today? Last week, I thought it was terrible because Bush was president. This week, I think it's great because Obama is president. They're also saying, well, maybe I feel better about the economy today because I think Barack Obama might actually pass healthcare legislation, and that's going to significantly ease the economic strains on my family. But having said that, I think the dominant thing you see when you look at this diagram is how our very perception of common reality is shaped by our partisan differences. And I'm now going to turn to a second, and as I say, more current, relevant, and troubling example. And that is the way in which hyperpartisanship appears to be distorting trust in the vaccines, and as a result, imperiling public health. And of course, I'm talking about COVID-19 and the fact that there's a sharp partisan gap in both the willingness to be vaccinated, the trust in the vaccine, and the level of vaccination. And as you are well aware, if you're following the news, really from the outset, there has been a discrepancy in the partisan support on the part of the leaders of the two parties for the public health measures that doctors and scientists have told us are necessary to combat the coronavirus pandemic. That Republican elected officials have been much less willing to impose closures at the state level, to impose mask mandates or social distancing requirements, etc. And that this has spread into the realm of the vaccine. There is some evidence that attitudes may be starting to change. We are obviously coping with several new variants or mutations. We've simplified matters and we're referring to them as a beta mutation or a delta mutation. And often that's actually encompassing several different strands of viral mutation. But the mutation, and this is the way, right, the process of rapid evolution works, the mutated versions have some sort of advantage over the original version, which is what is driving their prevalence, why they're being selected for. They're more transmissible, or they're better at defeating the body's immune response. And the result is that we are experiencing in this country a resurgence of the coronavirus, and that many places in the world have already experienced severe further coronavirus waves. And the fact that we have this partisan divide then is leading some of us to mistrust the vaccine, to mistrust public health officials, and in that sense is endangering those people, their friends, families, neighbors, and in a less direct way, all of us, both in terms of our health and in terms of the economic consequences of resurgence of active outbreaks. I want to focus in particular on the doctors, the nurses, the public health officials who have been heroic and who have suffered adverse consequences, both physically and psychologically, as a result of the way in which the coronavirus has overwhelmed our healthcare system, and how sad, how tragic it is that many of those same doctors and nurses are now going to be thrown back into the trenches, back into the COVID wards, back into new emergent situations because of the way in which partisan mistrust is leading to important pockets of low rates of vaccination at the state and local level. So let me give you a little bit more information on this, right? And what this diagram shows is, right, that states with larger shares of Trump vote have more adults who are hesitant to take the vaccine, with Wyoming and North Dakota having both the most votes for Trump. West Virginia is there too, and also then the highest levels of vaccine hesitancy, right? And to be clear, there are other factors that drive this. If you've had a severe outbreak, for instance, you may be more likely to overcome your hesitancy, but I think that the data is quite clear, showing the correlation, right? And if you look at the share of vaccination as opposed to the mistrust of the vaccine, obviously those two go together. Again, states with higher percentage support for Biden have more vaccinated adults, more residents with at least one shot. And I'm saying adults, it's now people 12 years old and older, and states where more people voted for Trump have lower rates of vaccination, right? And this then results in this map, which I think is quite stunning, right? The overlap between where Trump did well, the states that he won, and the lowest rates of vaccination. The darker the blue, the higher the rate of vaccination. The lighter the shade, the lower the rate of vaccination, right? And so as you can see, there is a very clear geographic correlation here. And then the sad news is that those states with low rates of vaccination, and they're color coded by partisanship, are also the states where COVID is resurgent, right? And so these four states, Florida, Nevada, Missouri, and Arkansas, I believe account for 40% of the new COVID cases, much of the hospitalization in the United States. Yeah. And so here we're really seeing the power of partisanship to shape our perception, even on an issue where potentially our lives, our welfare is at stake. So I just wanted to share that with you as a way of reinforcing this central conclusion of Klein's account of the social psychology of 21st century partisanship, that it results in identity protective cognition as opposed to truth sensitive cognition. And he says very clearly, there are some issues where we just want the right answer. Do you want to pay more for a car or less for a car? If one dealership has a better price, most people will go to that dealership, right? Whereas when it comes to partisanship today, if being a Republican means being somewhat skeptical of the vaccine, people are going to fall in line with that because that is their political identity. And we could talk a little bit about the kind of machismo or masculinity that may be incorporated into this, as well as the mistrust of science, the mistrust of elites in general, the sense that this is yet another issue where people who have more privilege and more opportunity think that they're better and are trying to tell the rest of us what to do, right? I think both of those issues feed into this, but the deeper and I think more fundamental perspective is that of just blanket partisanship. Democrats see this one way, Republicans see it another, and the result is that states where Republicans predominate are the states where COVID is coming back. Let me stop just for a moment. Obviously, this is in the news and on our minds. I do want to push on today into thinking about what we can do about this, starting with Klein and then broadening out. But I also want to see if anybody has any questions or thoughts at this juncture. Shall I just keep going?
Yeah.
Here I go. So, if you're convinced that this is a problem, that this kind of partisanship is distorting our capacity to talk to each other, to listen to each other, to learn from each other, perhaps even to think clearly on our own, what can we do about it? And here's what Ezra Klein suggests, and you'll see that there are a few different kinds of proposals. One of them is that we think critically about ourselves, right? And recognize that we're at a historical moment where polarization taps into deep social psychological tendencies to divide ourselves into hostile camps and then to protect ourselves from the other camp, and that potentially distorts our cognition. So manage ourselves in order to manage polarization. And one way to think about this would be to say, is there anything about your political party that makes it infallible, right? Is it headed by a 16th century Pope who has a direct line to God and so has been appointed to arbitrate issues of controversy in our historical moment? Or do we actually know that almost everybody who's in a leadership in our party is a flawed person, right? Beholden to donors, a person who makes calculations about what stance to take on issues based on how the polls and the discussion groups point them, right? And if we conclude that there's no reason to believe that our party is the infallible guide to everything right and good in politics, then we should be pretty self-critical if it turns out that we always find ourselves in agreement with our party, right? Something perhaps other than thinking through the policy issues on their own is guiding our cognition. And we've got a pretty good sense of what that is. It's identity protecting cognition. It's in-group loyalty and out-group hostility. So be aware that this can take over your thought process. There's a chapter in a book by Akins and Bartel on this that says it feels like thinking, right? It feels like you're thinking when your group identity is dictating what it is that your politics are. It feels like thinking because we're actually very good at using reason and argumentation to rationalize the beliefs that are the markers of our partisan identity. But if it is the partisan identity that comes first, the belief that comes second, and then the reasoning that comes last, you're not really reasoning with an open mind. You're rationalizing. And so one thing then to, in addition being suspicious of complete partisan identification and agreement, one thing to do is to try to think slow about politics, right? And there I'm referring to Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, right? The idea that as opposed to using a heuristic, using a shortcut, I'm a Democrat, therefore my position is this and that, you need to actually slow down and ask yourself, okay, I know what the party I believe in thinks, but what are the relevant facts? What are the relevant considerations? Why does the other side believe what it believes? Is it wholly confused, mistaken, obnoxious, mischievous, or maybe is there something to be said for its position, right? And so this would lead you then to scrutinize your own position as opposed to directing all your critical attention on your opponent's position. Try to be as critical of your party as you are of the party that you disagree with. And this might then serve as an antidote to negative partisanship, to the idea that the other side is terrible, a threat, a danger, and that we should be very cautious in making sure that they don't get power, right? And what this might ultimately lead to is some refashioning of our political identities, where partisanship becomes less total or less completely salient as the sole or main political identity. And we might want to emphasize instead an alternative political identity of being an open-minded, informed, reasonable, compromising citizen, right? That I think when we look at the opinion research, what we see is that 60, 70, 80 years ago, during the period of less polarization, when you asked people what their main political identity was, they tended to say citizen, American, Californian, etc., right? As opposed to Democrat or Republican. We're probably not going to get back to that place. But if you can at least offset your partisan identity by also emphasizing a different political identity, that we're all citizens, and it's a unifying identity. It's an identity that cuts across racial or religious or economic differences. That would be good for all of us. Now, these are all measures directed at individuals. And frankly, these are measures that you might call measures of political, ethical reform, right? And so the idea here is that you change yourself, and in so doing, you hope to set an example and the tone for politics. And I think we have to admit that these changes are unlikely to be systemic in their effects. And further, that the people who are most likely to manage themselves in order to diminish polarization are least likely to be the most polarized to begin with. And so the first 5 proposals here, I think, are extremely important as a matter of ethics. We should all be doing this, but at the same time, not likely on their own to be efficacious. And so Klein's sixth, or the way I'm enumerating it, that the sixth proposal here is what he calls bomb-proofing our politics against polarization. And so the idea here would be to look at those places where our political system is most vulnerable to the outcomes of polarization. And he focuses our attention on two, what you might call bottlenecks in our political process, that are most likely to do the most damage. And this is the budgeting and the debt ceiling process, right? And so when it comes to budgeting, as you are aware, every couple years, we seem to go through a crisis. Are we going to be able to pass a new budget? If we're not, is the government going to have to shut down? If the government shuts down, what happens to the goods and services that the government supplies, that all of us rely on? What happens to the economy as the single largest employer in our society closes its doors for a while, and those people are furloughed, right? And so if we could find ways to make the budgeting process automatic, or at least important elements of it at least continue automatically at the current level of funding, so that we don't have to engage in partisan brinksmanship over passing each budget. And given the way in which people depend on the federal government, given the heft of the federal government and our overall economy, this would be one place where we could minimize the damage that partisanship does. The debt ceiling, I think Klein is absolutely right, is perhaps even more important. And the issue here, right, is that Congress approves a budget, passes laws. Those laws entail spending more money. But even if the total budget and package of laws exceeds what the current legislative ceiling, the total level of debt that the federal government can incur. And please note that this is not an economic limit. This is a legislative, a political limit, because we have, for the last 30 years, had this debt ceiling legislation. If we don't then extend the debt ceiling, the federal government does not then have the capacity to cover all of its obligations. What does that mean in practice? That means that US Treasury bonds may not be paid out when presented, right? And they mature, different people cash them in at different points. And it's important to note two things here, right? The dollar is the de facto global currency still. It's the most secure, most widely used currency in the world. And US Treasury bonds are considered the safest investment asset in the world. And so many countries, governments, take their sovereign wealth funds and invest a substantial portion of their national savings in US government bonds, US Treasury bonds. And so if we ever, in fact, exceeded the debt ceiling and stopped paying out on Treasury notes, this wouldn't just be a problem for the US government or the US economy. This could be a cascading problem for the global economy. It could not just undermine confidence in the currency and the solvency of the United States. And I think it's worthwhile noting that one of the major bond rating agencies is considering downgrading US Treasury and US government assets because of our political paralysis and precisely this kind of issue, right? That this could be an absolute economic catastrophe. This could both cause a global recession and cause significant reputational harm to the United States in a world in which there is currently no good alternative, but China is clearly jockeying for increased prominence in the world economy. That this would, in other words, be damaging in many ways to our economy, our politics, our geopolitical position, our interests. And so, again, recognizing how polarized we are, how hard it is to get things done, the tendency to play brinksmanship politics with these issues, we should adopt legislation that says the debt ceiling will automatically be extended unless until Congress decides not to extend it, as opposed to the current situation, which is it has to be extended every time we come close to exceeding it. Now, turning to what I think is the most provocative and important set of Klein's recommendations, this has to do with democratizing. And the quote here from the conclusion of Klein's book is that the Republican Party has been warped by its ability to win elections without fashioning a majoritarian agenda. We've talked about this in previous lectures about the fact that the Republican Party is becoming, in many respects, a minoritarian party, that it has won the national popular vote in a presidential election once in the 21st century, and yet it's won the presidency 3 out of 6 times in the 21st century. That it is regularly, in fact, almost always the case that more people vote for Democrats than vote for Republicans for the House of Representatives and the Senate. In previous lectures, I've shown you data on this, which is that in order for the Democrats to control the House of Representatives, they have to get around 55, 56, 57% of the votes, depending on the scenario. That the Republicans can control the Senate with as little as around 33% of the overall votes, given that the least populous states are disproportionately represented in the Senate. And so in all these respects, the constitutional structure of the United States, in fact, allows the Republicans to hold out for the prospects of being able to govern while never winning a majority of popular support. But you add to that gerrymandering and efforts to make it more difficult to vote that are targeted at populations that live in urban areas that are less likely to have IDs, etc. And you end up with a party that not only feels that it doesn't need to appeal to everyone in the United States, but that it might just be able to rig the system so that it continues to win power with minority support and has a viable strategy for another generation, maybe, until the demographic changes that are currently playing out finally so deeply transform the American electorate that these strategies no longer have much of a prospect of success. And then perhaps the Republican Party collapses. Who knows what that does to our politics? Much better to try to incentivize the party to modernize. How do we do that? And we've got to change the features of our politics that allow the Republican Party to have some meaningful prospects for success without fashioning a majority coalition, a majoritarian agenda, as Klein puts it. So the first issue here is the Electoral College, right? And the way in which the Electoral College allowed Donald Trump and George W. Bush to win election despite not having a majority of the popular vote. The National Interstate Popular Vote Compact, which I think most of you are familiar with, I've mentioned it before, is a state level legislative effort to say that the state's electors are bound by law to vote for whoever won the popular vote, never mind what happened in their state. And if we get up to the point where states that control more than 50% of the electoral college vote sign that compact, then in a sense, the electoral college becomes irrelevant, right? We have bypassed it, even if we haven't completely gotten rid of it, because constitutional amendment is so hard to do in a period of partisan polarization. And now the Republican presidential candidate can't hope that they can piece together a bunch of small states that punch over their weight due to the way in which the electoral college is structured. They have to get the majority of the popular vote to win. That's going to influence the way in which they campaign, the policy positions they adopt, frankly, their stance on the diversification of the United States. And so that would fundamentally change the tone of national presidential politics. Shifting next to congressional elections. And you may know Maine already does this at the municipal level. Many cities have multi-member districts and ranked choice voting. The issue here is twofold. The first is to eliminate the importance, or at least significantly reduce the importance of the primary, which is the election in the United States that has the lowest level of participation. Roughly 20% of eligible voters vote in primary elections, and they tend to be most ideologically extreme. And so it's driving polarization. But even more important, if you have multi-member districts, you also have the possibility, you vote for more than one candidate, that as opposed to just whoever gets the nomination, they automatically win. There will be meaningful intra-party, within the party competition. And at that point, some Republicans may be competing for some Democrats or some moderates votes. And if you combine this with ranked choice voting, in which people can put a second and a third and a fourth and a fifth choice, it's much more likely that there will be rewards for moderation, for appealing to the average voter in the general election, as appealing to the most extreme voter in the primary election. Again, an effort to moderate both parties, but especially the Republican Party, by giving them a structural incentive to put forth candidates who appeal to the majority, to the average voter, as opposed to the most extreme ideologue in a primary election. Third proposal, again, I don't think any of this is particularly original to Klein. It's the way in which his analytic framework explains the significance of these proposals that is I think, illuminating. Third, eliminate the filibuster. And here his point is simple. The Senate already greatly amplifies the power of a minority of the population and an unrepresentative minority. There's a lot of research that shows that in the Senate, a white person's vote in this country is worth something between 1.2, 1.3 times what the average Black, Latino, or Asian person's vote is. Why is that? Well, because white people tend to live more in the less populous states. People of color tend to congregate in urban areas in more populous states. And so the Senate already amplifies the power of an unrepresentative minority. When you then allow 40%, right, of the senators to block the Senate from getting anything done, this is no longer an institution that, or a rule, I guess is what I should really say, that fosters deliberation, compromise, bipartisanship. It is employed systematically to block legislation in strategic, instrumental, partisan ways, and it still further amplifies the party of that, the power of that unrepresentative minority. It should be eliminated. And in a sense, I think what Ezra Klein would say to someone like Joe Manchin is, look, this is about the future of democracy in the United States. And let's not confuse present comedy, getting along with the other side, with actual governance, right? Yes, we do want there to be some compromise, but you've got to determine who you're compromising with and on what terms. And in the current environment, the filibuster is not an instrument of bipartisanship. In fact, it's an instrument of minoritarian rule, and we need to get rid of it to encourage the Republican Party to become a 21st century conservative party, a party that is reconciled to the demographic changes and has an agenda and puts forth candidates that actually appeal to a diverse 21st century electorate. Another thing that we could do, again, not news, is offer statehood to DC and Puerto Rico. And please note that DC would be around the median in terms of the populace, the overall population of the state. It would not be giving a very small territory a lot of power. It would actually be taking a lot of people who are currently unrepresented and giving them representation. There are a lot more people in DC than there are in Wyoming, Montana, or Delaware. Right. And so this is not unfair. Similarly, assuming that the people of Puerto Rico were to vote to seek statehood, we should afford them statehood. And doing this would then diminish somewhat the unrepresentative character and the racial skew of representation in the Senate. Finally, make gerrymandering and efforts to create impediments to voting more difficult or impossible to do. Of course, we're talking about the John Lewis and the For the People Acts, efforts to shore up voting rights and to prevent overly strategic partisan calculations from influencing the way in which districts are drawn. Now, the big question. So we've got this, right? Points 6 through 7 are really aimed not at individual ethical choice, but at systemic choice, either diminishing the damage that current polarization can do or creating incentives that lead to less polarization in the future. Can we do any of this here and now? Is this possible now? And I have to say, I'm somewhat skeptical that it is. And I don't think Klein necessarily thinks this is going to be a cakewalk either. That the problem is, of course, that the level of polarization prevents us from passing this kind of legislation, from undertaking these kinds of reforms. It's always going to be seen through a strategic lens. Which party does this advantage or disadvantage? And the party that is going to be disadvantaged by this, that's going to have to reform, that's going to have to identify new strategies and new coalitions, is going to do everything in its power to block these reforms. The party that thinks it gains advantage by being able to hold the debt ceiling or the budget hostage is unlikely to support these reforms. And so I do think we maybe need to think still further, that this is a first round of proposals, but we need further proposals to really figure out what we can do to unlock the hold that partisanship has on our minds and politics at the moment. Let me again pause. I've got more territory to cover, but this is the first time we're considering together some proposals to actually undo the kind of partisanship or the paralysis that it's generating in the United States today. I'm curious to hear if you have thoughts or questions about this. Anybody want to start us out?
I do.
Go ahead, Flossie.
I'm thinking that we need another Jonathan Swift who could do another Gulliver's Travels for us, so that we see how insane the situation has become. It's a comedy, except that it isn't. We need someone to write another essay like A Modest Proposal, where Swift pretends to be a traveler and he has come up with an answer about how to keep the Irish population from starving to death. And he proposes that a baby who has been suckling at his mother's breast is as good as a good chicken. And why don't we gather up the babies from the Irish and eat their babies? It's so outrageous that somehow it turned the tide. It's become so outrageous that when somebody looks at the insurrection and calls it an act of love, people aren't laughing. We've got to make them laugh. You can argue that you can't make the opposition look more ridiculous than they are. But maybe we need another All in the Family.
Well, you gave me an opening with All in the Family, and I think it's worthwhile remembering that Carol O'Connor, who played Archie Bunker, was appalled that lots of people would come up to him and congratulate him on
Yes,
portraying such a wonderful character, that there was finally somebody on television who thought and talked like them, and he was mortified because, of course, he thought it was satire. He thought it was a good way to expose just how behind the times some white working class people in Queens were, and lo and behold, that was not the way it was being interpreted.
but it did work. The children of the for a while we were all in the family, and people learned to say, I'm not like that. I can't be like that.
So I hope you are right, Flossie. I wonder. I have to say, we do have, let's just say, Saturday Night Live, where maybe if Swift were alive today, he would be a writer for that show, right? Yes. And we do have Alec Baldwin doing such a wonderful, sensitive send-up of Trump, really capturing the hyper-masculinity as well as the absurdity of so many of the positions he stakes. And yet,
and yet,
the majority of the Trump supporters don't even watch it, It's easy to immunize yourself against it in the media environment that we live in, and given the depth of our polarization. And so I understand what you're saying. I'm inclined to think we need, maybe in addition to a 21st century Swift, a couple other things. So one might be to pick a name, a 21st century Teddy Roosevelt, Somebody from within the Republican Party who emerges as a genuinely charismatic, once in a generation, powerful political leader and says, damn it, I'm going to modernize this party,
Maybe it's Liz Cheney.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, she seems more the past than the future of the Republican Party, and not that charismatic. But anyway, whoever it is, and I don't know if they're out there right now or if we're still waiting for them, we probably need the Republican Party to reform from within. I think the other thing we need, and this goes back to a proposal from Michael Tomasky, is some of our billionaires to start funding the reform of the Republican Party. And we need to be honest about how much an obstacle it is to reform that. And you know, when this whole business of Trump's hostile takeover of the Republican Party started, many people thought the donors would head for the doors, right? That this would be suicide for the Republican Party. And lo and behold, a new crop of donors sprung up. Old donors came back, and the Republican coffers seem to be pretty intact. You know, we'll have to see what happens in the aftermath of January 6th and in 2022. But you know, the truth about the role of money in American politics these days is that in order to succeed, you need not only self-scrutiny, a charismatic leader, some sense of irony about where you're going, satire, et cetera. You also need people to fund the operations. And so I don't know if it's Bloomberg or it's Soros or it's Bezos or it's Gates, who it is, but right at this historical moment, there are a few hundred people in this country who fund the parties. And unless and until some of those people really start putting their resources behind moderate or 21st century Republicans, reform is not going to start. And so that's another thought about maybe what we need in addition to a new Jonathan Swift.
David, this has been a very worthwhile conversation, if nothing else.
Thank you.
Highlighted some of the real problems. And yes, thank you for that.
And you know, if only, right, we could do more with it, but at least we're advancing our understanding somewhat. It looks like, Wilma, you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yes. I hate to throw cold water, but I can't think of a recent example when people in power relinquish power. Just voluntarily, oh yes, of course. So many of the proposals that have been considered mean, oh, they'll vote this way, we have to make them vote everyone will agree to vote a different way or give up this advantage or that advantage. That seems so terribly unrealistic to me. So barring that, I don't know how we get out of this morass. I really don't. I don't seem they're very hopeful. You know, I could make a quip and say, well, revolution's the answer. Unfortunately, revolution seems to be coming from the other side.
Yeah.
And I really don't know how this is all going to shake down.
Yeah, and so I'll just say for a moment, I think many of us are looking hard at the period, the first roughly 18 months of Barack Obama's presidency, when the Democrats had a super majority in the Senate, were in control of the House, and they got healthcare legislation done before Senator Ted Kennedy died, right, and was replaced by a Republican, and they lost their filibuster-proof majority. But maybe they should have done some of this other stuff, this more processed stuff, the stuff that frankly in the short term doesn't help as many people as Obamacare. And I think it's worthwhile recognizing we are a less unequal society today. This has been good for Black people. It's been good for Latinos. It's been good for poor people to expand Medicare, Medicaid, and create subsidized access to healthcare. It's been very good for many people. Millions of people have benefited from it. And yet, maybe the Democrats should have been a little bit less focused on getting a big piece of legislation passed and a little bit more focused on changing the structures through which power is exercised when they were in the position to do it. And then we can maybe hope Because there'll be another scenario. Who knows what the crisis is, right? Where the Democrats are again in a position to finally pass some of that legislation without Republican support. And that the next time they will recognize the urgency of doing it. Now, some of this stuff might be able to be done with a narrow majority, but a fair bit of it, I think you're absolutely right, Wilma. But at this point, with the filibuster requires a super majority, and the Republicans are not playing ball. Anybody else with the final comment for today?
Final answer.
Okay, so you guys take care and be safe. Next week, I'm going to start drilling deeper. And Wilma said maybe revolution. I said crisis, right, as opposed to revolution, right? But we need something to upend politics as usual. Next week, I'm going to start looking at proposals for reform that go deeper than the ones that Ezra Klein proposes in his book, and see maybe at least together we can talk some of that stuff through. I don't know about its prospects for success. I think some of it is a little bit less explicitly partisan than the stuff we were looking at today. All right, everybody. Fun as always. Take care. Look forward to continuing the conversation next week. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you. Have a good
Thank
week.
you, David.
Thank you, guys. Take care. Bye-bye.